The salty wind whipped across Skull's Haven as the merchant vessel dropped anchor in the notorious pirate cove. Captain Blackwood watched from his ship's deck as passengers disembarked, his weathered hands gripping the rail. 3 years since his wife's death, and still the loneliness ate at him like barnacles on a hull. Then she appeared, a woman in threadbare clothes, clutching a single carpet bag, her face hidden beneath a torn shawl. The other mail-order brides had arrived in their finest dresses, preening for wealthy husbands. But this one, something in her posture spoke of breeding, of secrets buried deep. What Captain Blackwood didn't know was that Lady Catherine Ashford had fled England with a price on her head, accused of murdering her abusive husband. The tattered rags hid a woman who could speak 5 languages, navigate by the stars, and had once commanded her own merchant fleet before scandal destroyed everything. As their eyes met across the crowded dock, both harbored deadly secrets that could either save them or damn them forever. Catherine's breath caught as she recognized the imposing figure studying her from the deck of the black-hulled ship. Even at this distance, Captain Nathaniel Blackwood commanded attention, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples. She'd heard whispers about him during the treacherous journey from Portsmouth. The Widow's Revenge, they called his ship, named for the wife he'd lost to fever. Some said he'd turned to piracy from grief. Others claimed he'd always sailed the line between merchant and marauder. She pulled her shawl tighter, hoping the shadows would hide the bruises that had finally begun to fade. 3 months since she'd fled London in the dead of night. 3 months since Lord Ashford's accidental tumble down the marble stairs of their estate. The magistrates had called it murder, but they hadn't seen the welts on her back or felt his hands around her throat the night before he died. The dock bustled with activity as other women were claimed by their intended husbands. Catherine watched a plump baker select a rosy-cheeked girl who giggled nervously at his attention. A grizzled tavern keeper chose a widow with kind eyes and calloused hands. One by one, the women found their matches, until Catherine stood alone beside her meager belongings. "You'll be Miss Winters, I presume?" The voice was deep, cultured, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. She turned to find Captain Blackwood had approached silently, his sea-green eyes studying her with unsettling intensity. Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice. Catherine Winters was the name she'd chosen for her new life, abandoning Lady Catherine Ashford to the scandal sheets and wanted posters of England. "I am Captain Nathaniel Blackwood." He gestured toward his ship with a slight bow that spoke of proper upbringing. "The Widow's Revenge awaits, if you'll have her as your new home." There was something in his tone, a formality that masked deeper currents. Catherine had learned to read men's intentions in the harsh years of her marriage, but this man's thoughts remained hidden behind eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Yes, Captain, though I should warn you, I'm not what most would consider a proper bride." She kept her voice carefully modulated, hiding the aristocratic accent that would mark her as surely as a brand. A ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I've found that propriety is often overrated, Miss Winters, especially in these waters." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His strength was evident even through the fabric of his coat, but his touch remained gentle. They walked toward the gangplank in comfortable silence, while Catherine tried to calm her racing heart. The Widow's Revenge was magnificent up close, sleek lines built for speed, brass fittings that gleamed despite the salt air, and a crew that watched their captain with a respect born of loyalty rather than fear. Whatever else Nathaniel Blackwood might be, he commanded through competence, not cruelty. "Your quarters are prepared," he said as they reached the deck. "We sail with the evening tide. I trust you have no pressing attachments to leave behind." Catherine nearly laughed at the irony. No attachments save the hangman's noose that awaited her return to England. "None whatsoever, Captain." Something flickered in his expression, understanding perhaps, or recognition of a fellow soul carrying burdens too heavy for sharing. "Good. The Caribbean offers many opportunities for those willing to embrace a different kind of life." As he led her below deck, Catherine caught glimpses of charts spread across his cabin table, marked with routes that skirted the edges of legitimate trade. Books lined the shelves. Poetry, philosophy, navigation texts in multiple languages. This was no common pirate's lair, but the domain of an educated man who'd chosen his path deliberately. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Blackwood," he said quietly, and Catherine realized her old life had just slipped beneath the waves forever. The morning air carried the salt tang of the harbor as Evangeline clutched her meager belongings closer to her chest. The weight of her reticule, containing the last of her coins and the precious correspondence that had brought her to this desperate moment, seemed heavier than the trunk she'd been forced to abandon 3 towns ago. She picked her way carefully along the weathered planks of the wharf, her worn boots treacherous on the damp wood. The cacophony of the docks assaulted her senses. Sailors calling out in rough voices, the creak and groan of ship timbers, the splash of waves against hulls. Never in her 23 years had she imagined herself in such a place, seeking such an arrangement. Captain Gabriel Blackthorne. Even his name sent an involuntary shiver through her as she recalled the bold script of his letters. Their correspondence had been brief, practical. He sought a wife to manage his household during his long absences at sea. She sought escape from the scandal that had destroyed everything she'd once held dear. Neither had been inclined toward romantic declarations or lengthy courtship rituals. A group of rough-looking men blocked her path, their eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl, despite her deliberately modest appearance. She'd traded her silk gowns for a simple brown traveling dress weeks ago, but apparently even that drew unwanted attention in a place like this. "Lost, miss?" One of them leered, stepping closer. "This ain't no place for a lady to be wandering alone." Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs, but she lifted her chin with the imperious bearing that had been drilled into her since childhood. "I am quite capable of managing my own affairs, thank you." The man laughed, a harsh sound that made her stomach turn. Fancy words from a fancy lady. But words don't mean much down here. Before she could retreat, a shadow fell across the group. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was deep, commanding, and carried an edge that made the men step back instantly. Evangeline turned to see a tall figure approaching, and her breath caught in her throat. Even without formal introductions, she knew immediately that this was Gabriel Blackthorne. He was nothing like what she'd imagined. Where she'd expected a grizzled sea captain, she found a man perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair that caught the morning light and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see through her carefully constructed facade. His clothes were well-tailored but practical, a navy coat that emphasized his broad shoulders, dark trousers, and boots that had seen their share of salt spray. But it was his bearing that truly set him apart. He moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to command, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of depths she couldn't fathom. Danger, certainly, but also an unexpected intelligence that made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons. "Captain," one of the men stammered, practically tripping over himself to back away. "We were just—" "Leaving," Gabriel finished, his tone brooking no argument. The men scattered like leaves before a storm. He turned those unsettling blue eyes on her, and Evangeline felt exposed despite her layers of deception. "Miss Evangeline Fairfax, I presume?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Up close, she could see the small scar that traced along his left temple, the weathered quality of his hands that spoke of a life lived hard. This was no gentleman playing at adventure. This was a man forged by salt and wind and whatever dark waters he'd navigated. "I apologize for that unpleasantness," he said, and she was surprised by the genuine courtesy in his voice. The docks can be treacherous for the unwary. "Thank you for your intervention," she managed, fighting to maintain her composure. "Though I assure you I am quite capable of handling such situations myself." Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, perhaps? "I don't doubt it. There's steel beneath that proper facade, isn't there, Miss Fairfax?" The observation was too close to the truth for comfort. She'd had to develop steel over these past months, had been forced to shed the sheltered existence of her former life like a snake shedding its skin. But how could he possibly see that after mere moments in her presence? "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Captain," she said carefully. His smile was knowing, and it sent an unexpected warmth through her despite the morning chill. "Come. My ship is moored at the end of the pier. We have much to discuss before we set sail." As he gestured for her to walk beside him, Evangeline realized that her carefully laid plans might be more complicated than she'd anticipated. She'd expected to marry a stranger and disappear into anonymity. She hadn't expected a man who might see through her carefully constructed lies to the woman she was trying so desperately to hide. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered dock as Eleanor clutched her meager possessions closer to her chest. The salt-tinged air filled her lungs, sharp and unfamiliar compared to the perfumed drawing rooms of her former life. She had arrived at the appointed meeting place an hour early, unable to bear another moment in the cramped boarding house where curious eyes followed her every movement. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the worn brown cloak that concealed her travel-stained dress. 3 weeks had passed since she'd fled London under cover of darkness. 3 weeks of careful economizing and sleepless nights, spent wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. The advertisement had seemed like divine providence when she'd found it tucked between the pages of a discarded newspaper. "Respectable gentleman seeks wife for colonial venture. Discretion assured." Eleanor watched the bustling harbour with growing unease. Merchant vessels bobbed alongside fishing boats, their crews calling out in languages she couldn't identify. The smell of tar and rope mingled with the aroma of exotic spices from distant lands. This world was as foreign to her as the surface of the moon, yet it represented her only chance at a future free from the scandal that had destroyed everything she'd once held dear. "Miss Hartwell?" She turned at the sound of her assumed name, expecting to see a middle-aged merchant or perhaps a clerk sent to escort her to her intended husband. Instead, she found herself face to face with a man who seemed to command the very air around him. Tall and broad-shouldered, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of years spent battling wind and waves. His dark hair was pulled back in a queue, and his clothing, while well-made, bore the practical cut of someone who valued function over fashion. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. Deep blue-green like the ocean depths, they seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade to the woman trembling beneath. "I am Captain Marcus Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Though I suspect that name alone has already told you more about your situation than my letters revealed." Eleanor's mind reeled. She had heard whispers of Captain Blackwood even in London's finest salons, tales of a ruthless privateer who walked the knife's edge between legitimate business and outright piracy. The authorities turned a blind eye to his methods because his ships brought wealth to the crown, but decent people crossed themselves when his name was mentioned. "You're afraid," he observed, and there was something almost gentle in his tone despite its rough edges. "Good. Fear will keep you alive in this world better than any prayer or proper breeding." She lifted her chin, summoning the dignity that had been bred into her bones. "I am not easily frightened, Captain. If I were, I would never have answered your advertisement." A slow smile spread across his features, transforming his harsh face into something surprisingly attractive. "There's the spirit I was hoping to find. Come then, Miss Hartwell, or whatever your real name might be, let's see if we can't make this arrangement work for both our purposes." He turned and began walking toward the edge of the dock, clearly expecting her to follow. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before hurrying after him, her practical boots clicking against the salt-stained planks. Whatever fate awaited her with this dangerous man, it could hardly be worse than the one she'd left behind. The ship that awaited them was magnificent in its deadly grace. The Serpent's Kiss rode the waves like a living thing, her black hull gleaming with fresh paint and her rigging singing in the morning breeze. Eleanor had expected something crude and frightening, but this vessel spoke of wealth and careful maintenance. Whatever else Captain Blackwood might be, he clearly took pride in his command. "She's beautiful," Eleanor murmured, surprising herself with the admission. "That she is," Blackwood agreed, and she caught him studying her profile as she gazed up at the ship's towering masts. "Beauty and danger often travel hand in hand, I've found. Sometimes the most treacherous waters hide the greatest treasures." Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt a flutter of something she couldn't name. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her feel exposed, as if he could see past her shabby disguise to the secrets she carried. Yet there was no judgment there, only a calculating assessment that somehow put her at ease. "Shall we go aboard then?" he asked, offering her his arm with surprising gallantry. "I'm eager to show you your new home, and we have much to discuss before we set sail with the evening tide." Eleanor placed her gloved hand on his coat sleeve, feeling the solid strength of the man beneath the fabric. Whatever bargain she was making with this pirate captain, there would be no turning back once she stepped aboard his ship. The hammock swayed gently with the ship's rhythm, but sleep remained as elusive as morning mist. Lady Catherine Ashworth? No, she reminded herself firmly. Catherine Miller now stared at the weathered planks above her head, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a ship at anchor. Water lapped against the hull, ropes creaked in the rigging, and somewhere above deck she could hear the low murmur of men's voices. Her stomach chose that moment to announce its emptiness with an undignified growl. When had she last eaten? The journey to Port Royal had been a blur of coach rides and cheap taverns, her meagre funds dwindling with each mile. Pride had sustained her longer than food. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Miss Miller?" came a young voice through the door. "Captain says you're to join him for supper, if you're feeling up to it." Catherine sat up too quickly, her head spinning. She'd been Catherine Miller for 3 days now, practicing the name until it rolled off her tongue without hesitation. The simple brown dress she wore, purchased in a second-hand shop with her last decent coins, felt strange after years of silk and velvet. "I'll be right there," she called, smoothing her hair as best she could. The small mirror mounted on the wall showed a face she barely recognized. Gone were the carefully arranged curls and perfectly applied rouge. In their place was a woman with sun-touched skin and worried eyes, her auburn hair braided simply down her back. The young sailor who waited outside her door couldn't have been more than 16, his face earnest and kind. "I'm Tommy, miss. Been with the captain 2 years now. He said to escort you proper-like to his cabin." As they walked through the ship's narrow passages, Catherine noted the unusual cleanliness. No smell of unwashed bodies or rotting food, no rats scurrying in the shadows. Whatever manner of pirate Marcus Blackthorne might be, he ran a tight ship. "Been at sea long, Tommy?" she asked, partly to calm her nerves and partly from genuine curiosity. "Since I was 14, miss. My pa sold fish in Port Royal, but the hurricanes took his boat. Captain Blackthorne gave me work when no one else would." Tommy's voice held unmistakable loyalty. "He's a good man, miss, no matter what the stories say." They stopped before a heavy oak door, and Tommy knocked twice. Enter came that familiar, deep voice. The captain's cabin was nothing like what Catherine had expected. Books lined shelves built into the walls, their leather spines suggesting everything from navigation manuals to poetry. Charts covered a large table, weighted down with brass instruments. Oil paintings, actual paintings, not crude sketches, decorated the walls, depicting seascapes and distant shores. Marcus Blackthorne rose from behind his desk, and Catherine's breath caught. He'd cleaned up since their first meeting, his dark hair tied back with a leather cord, his beard neatly trimmed. He wore a white shirt open at the collar and a navy coat that spoke of quality tailoring. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, those same penetrating blue-green eyes that seemed to see far too much. "Miss Miller, I trust you're feeling better." He gestured to a chair at a small table set for 2. Fine china and crystal caught the light from the oil lamps, creating an almost intimate atmosphere. "Much better, thank you." Catherine settled into the chair, acutely aware of his proximity as he sat across from her. "Your ship is not what I expected." A ghost of a smile played at his lips. "And what did you expect?" Heat crept up her neck. "I confess, I've never been aboard a ship like yours before. The Serpent's Call is my home, Miss Miller. I prefer my home to be civilized." He poured wine into her glass, the vintage a rich amber that spoke of expensive tastes. "I hope you don't mind a simple meal. We're between supply runs." Simple proved to be a vast understatement. Fresh bread, still warm from the galley, accompanied roasted chicken with herbs she couldn't identify. Vegetables that had no right being fresh after days at sea graced their plates alongside fruits that must have cost a small fortune in Port Royal. "You eat well for a—" she began, then stopped herself. "Pirate?" He said the word without shame, cutting into his chicken with deliberate precision. "I prefer the term privateer, though I admit the distinction grows thinner with each passing year." Catherine sipped her wine, studying his face in the lamplight. "Tommy speaks very highly of you." "Tommy's young enough to confuse gratitude with admiration." Marcus leaned back in his chair, regarding her with that unsettling intensity. "Tell me, Miss Miller, what made a woman of obvious refinement seek marriage to a stranger in the Caribbean?" The question hit like a physical blow. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she set down her glass. "I don't know what you mean." "Your posture, your speech patterns, the way you hold your fork, these things speak of breeding despite your current circumstances." His voice remained gentle, but his eyes never left her face. "I find myself curious about the story that brought you to my ship." The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as Eleanor emerged from the captain's cabin, her borrowed clothes hanging loose on her frame. She had spent a restless night on the small settee, hyper-aware of Captain Blackwood's presence in the adjoining chamber. Every creak of the ship had startled her awake, her mind conjuring images of her past catching up to her even here, miles from shore. The crew moved about their duties with practiced efficiency, some casting curious glances her way. She pulled the oversized coat tighter around herself, acutely conscious of how she must appear, a bedraggled woman aboard a ship full of hardened sailors. "You're up early." Eleanor turned to find Captain Blackwood approaching, his dark hair tousled by the sea breeze. In the morning light she could see the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent squinting against sun and spray. There was something different about him now. Less of the commanding presence from the night before, and more of the man who had offered her his cabin without question. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, then immediately regretted the confession. It revealed too much vulnerability. The sea takes getting used to. He moved to stand beside her at the rail, close enough that she caught the scent of salt and something distinctly masculine. Most landlubbers spend their first few nights fighting the motion of the waves. Eleanor nodded, though sleeplessness had little to do with the ship's movement and everything to do with the lies she carried. "How long until we reach port?" "Depends on the winds. Could be a week, maybe more." He studied her profile. "Having second thoughts about our arrangement?" The question hung between them like morning mist. Eleanor considered her options, limited as they were. Behind her lay London and Lord Pemberton's fury, ahead an uncertain future with a man she knew nothing about. Yet something in his manner suggested depths she hadn't expected from a pirate captain. "Are you?" she countered. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Direct. I like that in a woman." He turned to face her fully. "What I'm wondering is why a lady of obvious breeding would answer a sailor's advertisement for a wife." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "What makes you think I'm—" "Your hands, for one." Before she could pull away, he caught her wrist gently, turning her palm upward. "Soft. Despite your current circumstances, these aren't the hands of a woman who's worked for her bread." His thumb traced across her palm, sending an unexpected shiver through her. "Your speech, your posture, everything about you speaks of education, privilege." She jerked her hand free, panic rising in her throat. "You're mistaken, am I?" His voice remained gentle, but his eyes were sharp. "Eleanor isn't even your real name, is it?" The accusation hit like a physical blow. Eleanor took a step back, her mind racing for a plausible explanation. How could he possibly know? "I've seen enough desperate people to recognize the signs," he continued. "The way you flinch at unexpected sounds, how you scan every face as if looking for threats. You're running from something, or someone. Everyone has secrets, Captain." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. True enough. But most people's secrets don't involve assuming false identities and fleeing to sea with strangers. Eleanor gripped the rail, knuckles white. The truth pressed against her lips like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Part of her longed to confess everything. The scandal, Pemberton's threats, the terrible choice that had driven her from everything she'd ever known. But revealing herself meant placing this man and his crew in danger. "Some secrets are meant to protect others," she said finally. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition that made her stomach clench. "Others like yourself? Or others like the crew of this ship?" Before she could answer, a shout from the crow's nest split the morning air. "Sail ho! British colours approaching fast!" The transformation in Captain Blackwood was instantaneous. The curious, almost gentle man vanished, replaced by the commanding presence she'd witnessed the night before. "Where away?" he called back. 2 points off the starboard bow." Eleanor watched in fascination as the captain's entire bearing changed. He barked orders that sent men scrambling across the rigging, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. Only when the ship began to change course did he turn back to her. "Go below," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "Stay in the cabin until I come for you. Are we in danger?" For a moment his mask slipped, and she saw something that might have been concern. "That remains to be seen, but I won't have you on deck if there's trouble." As if summoned by his words, another shout rang out from above. This time, Eleanor caught the words that made her blood turn to ice. "She's flying naval colors, Captain. HMS Relentless." Eleanor's world tilted. HMS Relentless, Pemberton's ship. He had found her after all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as Evangeline emerged from the captain's cabin, her borrowed clothes still too large but clean and dry. The crew had already begun their daily routines, and she noticed how their eyes followed her movements with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. She had expected hostility, but what she found instead was something closer to cautious respect. "Miss," called out Barnes, the grizzled first mate she'd met the night before. "Captain's asked me to show you about the ship if you're willing." Evangeline nodded, grateful for something to occupy her mind. The previous night had been filled with restless dreams and questions she couldn't answer. Captain Thorne had been nothing like what she'd expected from their brief correspondence, and certainly nothing like the monster the stories painted him to be. Barnes led her through the ship with surprising gentleness, explaining the workings of the vessel with obvious pride. The Serpent's grace was larger than she'd imagined, with multiple decks and quarters that spoke of both wealth and practicality. Everything was immaculately maintained, from the polished brass fittings to the carefully coiled ropes. "She's a fine ship," Barnes said, patting the rail affectionately. "Captain's put his heart into her. Treats her crew fair too. Better than most I've sailed under." "How long have you served with him?" Evangeline asked, genuinely curious. "Near on 8 years now. Found me half dead in a Port Royal tavern, bleeding out from a knife wound courtesy of my former captain. Thorne patched me up, gave me a place on his crew when no one else would have me." Barnes glanced at her sideways. "He's got a way of collecting strays, our captain does." The comment stung more than it should have. Was that what she was to him? Another broken thing to be pitied and mended. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the intricate network of rigging above their heads. They were interrupted by shouting from the crow's nest. "Sail ho! 2 points off the starboard bow!" The effect on the crew was immediate. Men scrambled up the rigging, while others rushed to prepare the cannons. Evangeline felt her heart hammering as she watched the transformation from peaceful merchant vessel to what was unmistakably a ship of war. Captain Thorne appeared at her side as if from nowhere, his spyglass already trained on the horizon. "British naval frigate," he said grimly, "flying merchant colours, but I know her lines. The Retribution." "Are we in danger?" Evangeline asked, though she could see the answer in the tension that had gripped every man on deck. "That depends," Thorne replied, still studying the approaching vessel. "Barnes, what's our heading?" "Southwest by south, Captain. We're in international waters." Thorne lowered his spyglass, his expression thoughtful. "They're flying false colours and maintaining pursuit, despite our peaceful appearance. That suggests they're not interested in casual inspection." A chill ran down Evangeline's spine that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. They might be looking for someone specific. Thorne's sharp blue eyes fixed on her. "Would they have reason to be looking for you, Miss Ashworth?" The question hung in the air between them like a sword. Evangeline felt the weight of every lie she'd told, every half-truth she'd constructed to build her new identity. Around them, the crew continued their preparations, but she could sense their attention focused on this conversation. "I told you," she said carefully, "I left England to escape scandal. Perhaps someone wishes to ensure I don't return to cause further embarrassment." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The scandal that had driven her from London was far more serious than a simple matter of social embarrassment. There were people who would pay handsomely to see her brought back to face the consequences of what she'd discovered, what she'd threatened to expose. Thorne studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see straight through her carefully constructed facade. When he spoke, however, his voice was calm and reassuring. "Whatever your reasons for leaving England, Miss Ashworth, you're under my protection now. No one boards my ship without invitation." He turned to address his crew. "All hands, prepare to make sail. I want every inch of canvas we can manage. We'll show our British friends how fast the Serpent's Grace can fly." As the crew leaped into action, Evangeline found herself torn between gratitude and guilt. Thorne was protecting her without knowing the full extent of what that protection might cost him. The approaching ship represented more than just her past catching up with her. It represented danger to everyone aboard this vessel. She watched the captain move among his men with easy authority, issuing orders and encouragement in equal measure. These men trusted him completely, and now he was asking them to flee from a naval frigate because of her secrets. The wind caught their sails with a sharp crack, and the ship surged forward through the waves. Behind them, the British frigate adjusted course to follow, and Evangeline realized that no matter how fast they sailed, she couldn't outrun the truth forever. The storm struck without warning, turning the Caribbean waters into a writhing serpent of foam and fury. Isabella gripped the rail of Thesea's Revenge as the ship pitched violently, her knuckles white against the polished wood. Rain lashed her face like icy needles, but she refused to retreat below deck where the other women huddled in terror. "You should be in your cabin." Nathaniel's voice cut through the howling wind as he appeared beside her, his dark hair plastered against his skull, water streaming down his weathered face. "I'm not some delicate flower to wilt at the first sign of trouble," she shouted back, though her stomach lurched as another massive wave crashed over the bow. His laugh was sharp and admiring. "No, you certainly are not." He reached for her arm as the ship rolled again, but even the strongest oak bends in a hurricane. "Isabella." The intimacy of her name on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. These past weeks at sea had changed something between them, eroding the careful walls she'd built around herself. She'd caught him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and found herself seeking his company more than was proper for a woman supposedly promised to another man. "Captain!" The shout came from the crow's nest, barely audible above the storm. "Ship on the horizon, flying Spanish colors!" Nathaniel's expression darkened instantly. His hand moved instinctively to the cutlass at his side. "Spanish? In these waters?" He squinted through the driving rain, then cursed under his breath. That's no merchant vessel. Isabella followed his gaze and felt her blood turn to ice. Even through the storm, she could make out the sleek lines of a warship, its multiple masts cutting through the waves with predatory grace. But it wasn't the ship that terrified her. It was the possibility of who might be aboard. "Get below," Nathaniel commanded, his voice brooking no argument. "Now." But before Isabella could move, another voice rang out across the water, carried by the wind with chilling clarity, a voice that made her legs nearly buckle with recognition. "Surrender the woman, pirate, and we'll make your death quick." Nathaniel spun to face her, his eyes blazing with questions and something that might have been betrayal. "What woman? Isabella, what aren't you telling me?" Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her like a sandcastle before the tide. Don Carlos had found her. Somehow, impossibly, her stepfather had tracked her across an ocean and into Nathaniel's protection. The man who had tried to force her into marriage with his vile nephew, who had stolen her inheritance and driven her to desperate flight, was here. She began, but the words stuck in her throat like shards of glass. "Captain Torres sends his regards to Lady Isabella Castillo." The voice boomed again, and Isabella saw Nathaniel's face change as the pieces fell into place. "Lady Isabella Castillo," he repeated slowly, his voice deadly quiet despite the chaos around them. "The Spanish nobleman's daughter who disappeared after her father's death, the one with a price on her head for theft and murder. It's not what you think," she gasped, reaching for him, but he stepped back as if her touch burned. "Isn't it? Let me guess. You're not really a simple mail-order bride seeking a new life. You're a fugitive who lied about everything, including your name." His eyes, which had looked at her with such warmth only moments before, were now cold as Arctic seas. The Spanish ship was closing fast, its cannons visible even through the storm. Isabella could see figures moving on deck, could imagine Don Carlos standing at the bow like some avenging demon from her nightmares. "They'll kill you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you don't give me up, they'll sink this ship and everyone on it." "And if I do give you up?" His question was soft, dangerous. Isabella closed her eyes against the pain. She'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when her past would destroy any chance of happiness she might have found. "If you give me up, I'll hang for crimes I didn't commit, but your crew will live." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the storm's fury and the approaching threat. When she opened her eyes, Nathaniel was studying her with an expression she couldn't read. "The theft and murder charges," he said finally. "Did you do it?" "No." The word came out fierce and certain. "But I can't prove my innocence, not against Don Carlos's word and his connections." Another cannon boom echoed across the water, a warning shot that splashed dangerously close to their hull. Nathaniel's crew was already moving, preparing for battle with the efficiency of men who'd faced death before. "Choose quickly, Captain," Isabella said, her chin lifting with the pride that had sustained her through months of exile. "Save your ship or damn us all for a woman you barely know." But as she spoke the words, she realized with devastating clarity that somewhere in the past weeks she had fallen hopelessly in love with this dangerous, complicated man who might now become her executioner. The storm struck without warning, just as dawn broke over the Caribbean waters. Isabella had grown accustomed to the gentle rocking of the siren's call, but now the ship pitched violently, sending her stumbling across the captain's cabin as she tried to dress. "Stay below deck," Blackwood commanded as he burst through the door, his dark hair whipping in the wind that followed him inside. Water dripped from his coat, and his eyes held the focused intensity she'd come to recognize when he was in his element. "This one's going to be rough." Before she could respond, he was gone again, his boots pounding up the stairs to the deck above. Through the small porthole, Isabella could see the sky had turned an ominous grey-green, and the waves that had seemed so manageable yesterday now towered like moving mountains. The ship groaned and creaked as it fought against the storm's fury. Isabella braced herself against the desk, watching Blackwood's maps and instruments slide back and forth with each violent lurch. She'd never felt so helpless, so utterly at the mercy of forces beyond her control. It reminded her too much of the night she'd fled London, when her world had collapsed around her just as suddenly. Hours passed in a blur of thunderous waves and howling wind. The cabin grew stuffy and warm despite the chaos outside, and Isabella found herself thinking of her father's estate, of quiet mornings in the garden where the only sounds were birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves. How had her life taken such a dramatic turn? When the door opened again, it wasn't Blackwood who entered but his first mate, a weathered man named Davies, whose usually jovial demeanor had been replaced by grim concern. "Captain's been injured," he said without preamble, rain streaming from his oilskin coat. "Nothing fatal, but he's taken a nasty blow to the head. Won't leave the helm, stubborn as he is." Isabella's heart lurched more violently than the ship. How badly is he hurt? Hard to say in this weather. He's conscious, but... Davies hesitated, studying her face with shrewd eyes. "He might listen to you, won't listen to any of us." Without hesitation, Isabella followed Davies up the narrow stairs, immediately regretting it as the full force of the storm hit her. The wind tore at her hair and clothes with vicious fingers, and the deck was slick with seawater and rain. She could barely see through the downpour, but there was Blackwood at the wheel, his left temple marked with blood that the rain couldn't quite wash away. "What are you doing up here?" he shouted over the wind when he spotted her. "I told you to stay below." "You're bleeding," she called back, making her way carefully across the treacherous deck. Several crew members worked frantically with the rigging, their movements practiced despite the chaos. "It's nothing." But even as he said it, she could see him sway slightly, his grip on the wheel tightening. Isabella reached him just as another massive wave crashed over the bow, sending spray across the entire ship. Without thinking, she pressed herself against his back, wrapping her arms around his waist to steady them both. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the way he fought, not just the storm, but his own body's rebellion against the injury. "Let Davies take over," she said close to his ear, "just for a few minutes." "Can't," he replied through gritted teeth. "We're too close to the reef. One wrong turn." She understood then. They weren't just battling the storm, they were navigating a deadly maze of coral and rock that could tear the ship apart in seconds. His expertise, even injured, was the only thing standing between them and disaster. So she stayed pressed against him, becoming his anchor as he fought to keep them all alive. She felt every movement he made, every correction of the wheel, every moment when his strength wavered, and she helped hold him upright. It was intimate in a way that went beyond anything physical. She was sharing his burden, his responsibility for every soul aboard the ship. Gradually, impossibly, the storm began to weaken. The waves grew less violent, the wind less vicious. As the immediate danger passed, Blackwood finally allowed Davies to take the wheel, and Isabella helped him stumble toward the stairs. In the relative quiet of his cabin, she examined the gash on his temple with gentle fingers. "You could have been killed," she whispered, cleaning the wound with water from the wash basin. "But I wasn't." His dark eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You came up in the storm. For me." "Of course I did." The words slipped out before she could stop them, honest and unguarded. Something shifted between them in that moment. Something deeper than attraction or convenience. When he reached up to touch her face with trembling fingers, she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, finally understanding that whatever lay ahead, she was no longer running alone. The storm struck without warning, transforming the placid Caribbean waters into a churning cauldron of foam and fury. Isabella gripped the cabin's wooden frame as the ship pitched violently, her stomach lurching with each savage roll. Through the porthole, she watched mountainous waves crash against the deck, sending sprays of salt water cascading across the planks where she'd walked so peacefully just hours before. "Stay below," Marcus had commanded, before disappearing topside, his face grim with the weight of command. But the walls of her cabin felt like a prison as the tempest raged, and worry gnawed at her with each thunderous crash above. The door burst open, admitting a drenched sailor whose wild eyes found hers immediately. "Captain's orders, milady. You're to come to his quarters. Ship's taking on water in the lower decks." Isabella's blood chilled. She'd heard the stories of ships lost to storms like this, swallowed by the hungry sea with all hands aboard. Following the sailor through corridors that tilted at impossible angles, she fought to maintain her footing as the ship groaned and protested around them. Marcus's quarters provided little sanctuary from the chaos. Charts and instruments slid across his desk with each violent motion, and rain lashed against the stern windows in sheets. He stood, braced against his table, shouting orders to the men who came and went like ghosts in the storm's fury. "The mainmast cracked," reported his first mate, water streaming from his coat. "If it goes, we'll lose steerage." "Then shore it up," Marcus growled, his knuckles white as he gripped the table's edge. "Use whatever timber you can find. Strip it from the gun deck if necessary." Isabella pressed herself against the wall, feeling utterly useless as the men fought for their lives. The ship lurched again, more violently than before, and she heard something massive crack above their heads. Through the windows she glimpsed the sea reaching for them like grasping fingers, promising oblivion. "Captain!" Another sailor stumbled through the door. Portuguese man-of-war spotted to the south, three-decker flying Admiral Santos's colours. The blood drained from Marcus's face. Isabella's heart stopped beating entirely. Admiral Santos, the name hit her like a physical blow, dredging up memories she'd tried desperately to bury. Her father's ships, her father's most trusted commander, the man who'd searched every port from Lisbon to the Americas looking for her. "In this weather?" Marcus demanded. "Aye, sir. Storms breaking up to the south. They've got the wind with them." Isabella's mind raced. Santos wouldn't be here by coincidence. Somehow, despite all her precautions, despite the new name and humble clothes, he'd found her trail. The scandal that had driven her from her father's house would pale beside what would happen if Santos discovered her aboard a pirate vessel. Isabella. Marcus's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. His eyes found hers across the cabin, and she saw something she'd never expected. Fear, not for himself, but for her. "Go below, find the safest place you can, and—" No. The word escaped before she could stop it. "I won't hide while you face this alone. You don't understand. Santos takes no prisoners. If he finds you here, I know exactly who Admiral Santos is." The confession tumbled out, heavy with the weight of truth she'd carried too long. "He serves under my father's command, Admiral Henrique Delacroix of the Portuguese fleet." The cabin fell silent except for the storm's dying rage. Marcus stared at her as if she'd transformed into someone else entirely, which perhaps she had. The carefully constructed lie of Isabella, the shopkeeper's daughter, crumbled away, leaving only the truth she'd hidden behind rags and deception. "Your father," Marcus repeated slowly, "is Admiral Delacroix, the scourge of the Caribbean, the man who sent more pirates to the gallows than any other officer in the New World." Isabella lifted her chin, meeting his stare despite the pain it caused. "Yes." The ship's motion steadied as the storm's fury began to abate, but the tension in the cabin only intensified. She could see Marcus's mind working, calculating the implications of her revelation. She was not just the mail-order bride he'd grown to cherish, she was the daughter of his greatest enemy, the man who'd made hunting pirates his holy crusade. "They're closing fast, Captain," the first mate reported grimly. "We've got maybe an hour before they're within cannon range." Marcus never took his eyes off Isabella. "And you?" he asked quietly. "What happens when Santos finds Admiral Delacroix's missing daughter aboard my ship?" The question hung between them like a blade. Isabella thought of her father's rage when she'd refused the marriage he'd arranged, of the scandal that had erupted when she'd fled rather than submit to a loveless union with a man twice her age. That disgrace would seem like nothing compared to this. "He'll assume you kidnapped me," she whispered. "He'll use it as justification to destroy you completely." Outside, the storm clouds parted, revealing the approaching warship like a harbinger of judgment. The storm had passed, leaving the siren's call rocking gently beneath a canopy of stars, but Ilara's heart remained turbulent. She stood at the bow, salt spray misting her face as she gripped the railing with white knuckles. Marcus had given her space after their confrontation, but she could feel his presence like a phantom touch, even when he wasn't near. 3 days had passed since she'd nearly kissed him in his cabin. 3 days of stolen glances and carefully measured words. 3 days of pretending her pulse didn't quicken every time he barked orders to his crew or emerged from below deck with his shirt clinging to his broad shoulders. "You'll wear a groove in that wood if you keep gripping it so tight." She didn't turn at the sound of his voice, though her body betrayed her with a visible shiver. "I couldn't sleep." Neither could I. His footsteps approached slowly, deliberately. "The men are growing restless. They've noticed the tension between us." What tension? The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Marcus moved to stand beside her, close enough that his warmth penetrated the cool night air. The kind that makes a crew nervous. They need to know their captain's mind is clear. "And is it?" She finally looked at him, immediately regretting the decision. Moonlight carved harsh shadows across his features, making him look every inch the dangerous pirate the world believed him to be. But his eyes held a gentleness that made her chest ache. Not even close. His admission hung between them like a challenge. Before she could respond, a shout erupted from the crow's nest. "Ship approaching, port side!" Marcus transformed instantly, the tender man vanishing behind the mask of command. "Colors!" he bellowed. "Can't make them out, Captain. She's running dark." Ilara's blood turned to ice. A ship running without lights at night meant only one thing: pursuit. Her past had finally caught up with her. "All hands on deck!" Marcus's voice boomed across the ship. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers!" The crew burst into motion, but Ilara remained frozen at the rail, watching the dark shape cutting through the waves behind them. It was too far to make out details, but something in her bones told her this wasn't a chance encounter. "Get below," Marcus ordered, his hand finding her elbow. "No." She pulled away, surprising herself with her vehemence. "If this is about me, you don't know that it is, don't I?" She turned to face him fully, years of running finally taking their toll. "How many ships have pursued you since I came aboard? How many times have you been forced to flee in the dead of night?" His silence was answer enough. "I won't hide while your crew faces danger because of me." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I'm tired of running, Marcus. So very tired." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps even admiration. "Then we face this together." The pursuing ship gained steadily, its sleek lines now visible in the moonlight. Ilara recognized the design immediately, one of Lord Blackwood's vessels. Her former benefactor had found her at last. "They're flying a parley flag, called the Lookout." Marcus cursed under his breath. "Parley means they want to talk, not fight. That's almost worse." "Why?" "Because it means they're confident they don't need violence to get what they came for." The ship drew alongside, and Ilara's worst fears were confirmed. Lord Blackwood himself stood at the rail, his silver hair gleaming in the moonlight, his cruel smile visible even across the water. "Captain Sterling," Blackwood's cultured voice carried easily across the gap between ships. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Marcus stepped protectively in front of Ilara, but she moved to stand beside him instead. "I belong to no one, Harold." Blackwood's laugh was like breaking glass. "Still spirited, I see. How delightful. I've missed our games, my dear Elena." The use of her real name sent murmurs through Marcus's crew. She felt their curious gazes burning into her back, felt the weight of secrets finally demanding to be revealed. "Return what you stole, and I might be merciful," Blackwood continued. "Keep running, and I'll see you both hang for piracy and theft." "I stole nothing that wasn't already mine," Ilara called back, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong. Your father's debts made everything yours mine by right, including you." Marcus's hand moved to his sword hilt. "The lady made her choice. Did she? Or did she simply trade one prison for another?" Blackwood's smile widened. "Tell me, Captain, do you even know who she really is? What she's done?" Alara felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. She could continue the charade, let Marcus believe she was simply Clara, a desperate woman seeking a new life. Or she could trust him with the truth that would either damn them both or set them free. She made her choice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as Isabella stood at the rail, watching the crew prepare for what Blackwood had grimly called the reckoning. 3 ships had appeared on the horizon at dawn, sleek vessels bearing the colours of Lord Hartwell's private fleet. Her past had finally caught up to her, and with it the terrible choice she had been dreading. Blackwood emerged from his cabin, his face a mask of controlled fury. He had spent the night poring over charts and conferring with his first mate, but Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from his cutlass. "They're flying a parley flag," Marcus reported, lowering his spyglass. "The lead ship wants to talk." "Of course they do," Blackwood muttered, his eyes finding Isabella's across the deck. "They want their prize back." Isabella's stomach clenched. She had told him everything the night before, about Lord Hartwell's obsession with her, the trumped-up charges that had driven her from England, the way he had systematically destroyed anyone who had tried to help her. Blackwood had listened in silence, his jaw growing tighter with each revelation. "Let them come," he said now, his voice carrying across the deck. "But we meet them on our terms." The parley took place on a small, uninhabited island 2 hours later. Isabella insisted on accompanying Blackwood despite his protests, knowing that her presence might be the only thing preventing an immediate battle. They brought a small crew, but she could see Hartwell's men outnumbered them 3-1. Lord Hartwell himself waited on the beach, resplendent in his naval uniform, his pale eyes fixing on Isabella with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He was exactly as she remembered. Handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, with perfectly groomed blonde hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Lady Isabella," he called out as they approached, his tone mockingly formal. "How far you've fallen. From a countess to a pirate's whore." Blackwood's hand moved to his sword, but Isabella placed a restraining touch on his arm. "What do you want, Hartwell?" "What's mine, of course." Hartwell's gaze swept over her dismissively. "You think you can run forever? You belong to me, Isabella, you always have." "She belongs to no one," Blackwood said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "Certainly not to a man who frames innocent women for his own twisted desires." Hartwell laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Innocent, is that what she's told you? Did she mention the fortune she stole, the servants she bribed, the way she killed her own husband?" Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. "That's a lie, and you know it." "Do I?" Hartwell pulled out a rolled parchment. "I have witnesses, my dear. Signed testimonies. Your husband's physician will swear you poisoned the poor man. His valet saw you tampering with his medicine." His smile turned predatory. "Of course, these witnesses might suffer from poor memory if you come with me willingly." Blackwood stepped forward, his presence radiating menace. "You're threatening the wrong woman, Hartwell. Isabella is under my protection now." "Your protection?" Hartwell's laugh was sharp. "You're a pirate, Blackwood. A criminal. What protection can you offer against the full might of His Majesty's Navy?" He gestured toward his ships. "I have letters of marque, official sanction to bring her back. You have nothing but a reputation for barbarism." Isabella's mind raced. She could see the trap closing around them. Hartwell had always been clever, always 3 steps ahead. He had probably planned this moment from the day she had escaped England. "There's another option," she said suddenly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Both men turned to look at her. "A trial by combat," she continued. "Single combat between the 2 of you. If Captain Blackwood wins, you withdraw your ships and your charges. If you win," she swallowed hard, "I'll come with you willingly." Hartwell's eyes lit up with interest. How delightfully archaic. "But why would I agree to such terms when I already hold all the cards?" "Because you're a coward," Isabella said quietly. "You've always been a coward, hiding behind your title and your wealth. You want me to come to you as a conquered prize, not a terrified victim." The insult hit its mark. Hartwell's face flushed red, and his hand moved to his sword. "Very well. But when I kill your pirate captain, you'll remember that you chose this path." Blackwood caught Isabella's arm as Hartwell moved away to confer with his men. "This is madness," he said in a low voice. "I won't let you stake your freedom on my sword arm." "It's not your choice to make," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "This is my fight, Marcus. It always has been. I'm just finally choosing to fight it on my own terms." The circle was drawn in the sand as the sun climbed higher, and Isabella found herself standing between two worlds, the safety of lies and the dangerous truth of love. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as Eleanor stood at the bow, watching the endless expanse of blue stretch toward the horizon. 3 weeks had passed since they'd fled Port Royal, and each day brought them closer to Nassau, and closer to the reckoning she both craved and feared. Behind her, she could hear Blackwood's voice carrying orders to the crew, that familiar commanding tone that had once terrified her now bringing an unexpected comfort. The transformation in their relationship still amazed her. Where once there had been suspicion and careful distance, now there existed something deeper, more dangerous than mere attraction. Lost in thought again? His voice was warm against her ear as strong arms encircled her waist from behind. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, savoring the solid strength of him. "Always," she murmured. "I was thinking about how different everything is now." "Different how?" He pressed a kiss to the sensitive spot behind her ear that never failed to make her shiver. "Us. This." She gestured toward the sea. "A month ago I was Lady Eleanor Ashworth, trapped in a gilded cage. Now I'm—" She paused, unsure how to finish. "Now you're free," he said quietly, "and more beautiful for it." She turned in his arms, studying the weathered planes of his face. The scar along his jaw caught the morning light, and she traced it gently with her fingertip. "How can you see beauty in someone so damaged?" His eyes darkened. "Because I know what it costs to survive. Every scar, every secret, every moment of pain, they've made you who you are. And who you are, Eleanor, is magnificent." Before she could respond, a shout from the crow's nest shattered the moment. "Sail ho! 3 points off the starboard bow!" Blackwood's demeanor shifted instantly, the tender lover replaced by the commanding captain. He strode to the rail, pulling out his spyglass. Eleanor watched tension creep across his shoulders as he studied the approaching vessel. "What is it?" she asked, though something cold was already settling in her stomach. "British naval frigate," he said grimly, "flying Admiral Ashworth's personal pennant." The world tilted beneath Eleanor's feet. "My father," she whispered. "All hands on deck," Blackwood roared. "Prepare for pursuit." The siren's song erupted into controlled chaos as the crew scrambled to their stations. Eleanor gripped the rail, her knuckles white as she watched the distant ship grow larger. She should have known her father wouldn't give up so easily. Admiral Lord Ashworth was nothing if not persistent, especially when his reputation was at stake. Eleanor Blackwood's hand covered hers. "We can outrun them. The siren's song is faster than any naval vessel." But even as he spoke, Eleanor could see the doubt in his eyes. The frigate was already closer than it should have been, which meant they'd been tracking them for some time. Her father was many things, but he was also a brilliant naval strategist. "Captain!" Thomas appeared at Blackwood's elbow. "There's another ship coming up behind us. We're caught between them." Eleanor's heart sank as she turned to see the second vessel emerging from a bank of morning mist. A trap. Her father had laid a careful trap, and they'd sailed directly into it. "What are your orders, Captain?" Thomas asked, his hand already moving toward his cutlass. Eleanor watched Blackwood's jaw clench as he weighed their options. She knew what he was thinking, the same thing she was. They could fight, but against 2 naval frigates, even the notorious Captain Blackwood would be hard-pressed to emerge victorious. Too many of his crew would die in the attempt. "There's another option," she said quietly. Both men turned to her, and she saw understanding dawn in Blackwood's eyes. "No," he said firmly. "Absolutely not. It's the only way to ensure your crew's safety," she continued, her voice growing stronger despite the fear clawing at her chest. "If I surrender myself willingly, my father will have what he came for. He'll let the rest of you go." "Like hell he will," Blackwood snarled. "And even if he would, I won't trade your life for theirs." "It wouldn't be my life," Eleanor said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Return to England would mean facing charges for her involvement in Charles's death, marriage to Lord Pemberton if she was fortunate, or worse if she wasn't. "I knew this day would come eventually." "Did you?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Because I thought we were building something here, something worth fighting for." The pain in his eyes nearly broke her resolve. "We were, we are, but I won't be responsible for the deaths of innocent men." The approaching ships were close enough now that she could make out figures on their decks. Soon they would be within cannon range, and any choice would be taken from them entirely. "There has to be another way," Blackwood said desperately. Eleanor reached up to cup his face in her hands. "Sometimes love means knowing when to let go." The dawn brought no relief from the storm that had battered the siren's call through the night. Elara pressed herself against the cabin wall as another wave crashed over the deck above, sending torrents of seawater through the gaps in the wooden planking. Her wedding dress, once pristine white silk, now hung in sodden tatters around her ankles. Captain Blackwood, Marcus, she reminded herself, had been on deck since before sunrise, his voice cutting through the howling wind as he barked orders to his crew. Through the small porthole, she could see him moving with practiced grace across the rain-slicked deck, seemingly unbothered by the chaos surrounding them. The ship lurched violently to starboard, and Elara's stomach dropped as they plunged into another trough between waves. She had thought herself beyond fear after everything she had endured, but the raw power of the storm humbled her completely. The ocean cared nothing for her noble birth or her carefully constructed lies. A sharp knock at the cabin door made her jump. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Finn or one of the other crew members. Instead, Marcus himself ducked through the doorway, water streaming from his dark hair and clothes. "The storm's getting worse," he said without preamble, his grey eyes serious. "I need you to know, if something happens to the ship, if we don't make it through this—" "Don't," Elara interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Don't speak as if we're already lost." He studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. "You're not what I expected when I agreed to this arrangement. Neither are you." The confession slipped out before she could stop it. "I thought you would be different, cruder, more like the stories they tell about pirates." A ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "And what do the stories say about pirate brides?" Heat rose in her cheeks despite the cold. "That they don't exist. That men like you take what they want and discard it when they're finished. Perhaps some do." He moved closer, and she could smell salt spray and something uniquely him, leather and warmth and danger. "But I've never been interested in taking anything that isn't freely given." The ship groaned around them, timber straining against the relentless assault of wind and water. Somewhere above, she heard a man cry out, followed by Marcus's first mate shouting new orders. But in the small space of the cabin, with Marcus standing so close she could see the water droplets clinging to his dark lashes, the storm seemed distant. "There's something you should know," she began, the words scraping against her throat like broken glass. "About why I really came here. About who I—" The door burst open without warning, and Finn stumbled inside, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "Captain, you need to see this. Now." Marcus straightened immediately, every trace of softness vanishing from his features. "What is it?" "Ship on the horizon, flying Royal Navy colors, but—" Finn's eyes darted nervously to Elara. "She's not running from the storm like she should be. She's heading straight for us, full sail." Elara's blood turned to ice in her veins. The Royal Navy. Here. Now. It could be coincidence. Pirates were always being hunted. but something deep in her bones told her it wasn't chance that had brought them here. Marcus was already moving toward the door when Finn spoke again. "Captain, there's more. We managed to get a look at her through the spyglass before the rain got too heavy. She's flying a personal pennant beneath the Navy colors." "Whose?" Marcus asked, though his eyes were already on Ilara, reading the truth in her white face. "Lord Pemberton's." The name hit the cabin like a physical blow. Ilara gripped the edge of the small table to keep from falling as memories crashed over her. Richard Pemberton's hands on her skin, his threats whispered in her ear, the look in his eyes when she had finally managed to escape his private study that terrible night. "You know him." It wasn't a question. Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. She nodded, unable to speak past the terror closing her throat. Pemberton had found her. Somehow, despite all her careful planning, all her desperate running, he had tracked her down even here, in the middle of the endless ocean. "He's the reason you're here," Marcus continued, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The reason you answered my advertisement. The reason you're running." Another nod. The ship pitched sickeningly, and she wondered if they would all be claimed by the storm before Pemberton could reach her. Perhaps that would be a mercy. Marcus turned to Finn. "How long until they reach us?" "In this weather? 2 hours, maybe less if the storm breaks." "Then we'd better hope it doesn't." Marcus looked back at Ilara, and she saw something fierce and protective burning in his grey eyes. "Whatever he wants, whatever happened between you, he won't take you from this ship. I give you my word." The storm had passed, but its aftermath clung to the ship like a shroud. Eleanor stood at the bow, watching the horizon where 3 dark shapes cut through the morning mist. Her father's ships, flying the crimson banner of House Whitmore, approached with the inevitability of fate itself. Behind her, she could hear Marcus barking orders to his crew. The siren's call had sustained damage in the storm, torn sails, a cracked mainmast, and several injured men below deck. They were in no condition for a fight, yet the pirate captain's voice carried no hint of surrender. "Eleanor." His voice was low, meant for her alone. She turned to find him approaching, his dark hair still damp from the storm, a fresh cut across his cheekbone. "There's still time. The longboat survived. I can have you ashore within the hour." She studied his face, memorizing the sharp line of his jaw, the intensity in his storm-grey eyes. "And leave you to face this alone. This isn't your fight anymore." His hands found her shoulders, warm and steady despite everything. "Whatever your father wants, whatever drove you to flee England, you don't have to face it. Not if you don't want to." The lead ship was close enough now that she could make out figures on the deck. Her chest tightened as she recognized the tall, imposing silhouette of Lord Whitmore himself. Even at this distance, his presence commanded attention, demanded submission. "You don't understand," she whispered. "There is no running from him. Not for me, and certainly not for anyone who's helped me." She touched the cut on Marcus's face gently. "He'll see you hanged for taking what he considers his property." Marcus caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "Let him try. I've faced worse than angry fathers." "Not like him." Eleanor's voice cracked. "You've met merchants and minor nobles, Marcus. My father is Lord Admiral Whitmore. He has the authority of the crown behind him, and he's never been denied anything he wanted, including a suitable marriage for his only daughter." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. She saw the recognition dawn in his eyes. Every sailor knew of Lord Admiral Whitmore, the man who'd made piracy a hanging offence across 3 kingdoms, the man who'd sent more ships to the bottom of the sea than any storm. "Christ," he breathed. "You're Admiral Whitmore's daughter. The same daughter who was meant to marry Lord Ashford's son, securing a political alliance worth more than 100 ships." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "Until I discovered dear Harold preferred his stable boys to any woman, and threatened to expose him rather than live a lie." A cannon fired across their bow, a warning shot that sent spray cascading over the deck. The crew tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Marcus held up a hand for restraint. Signal flags going up, called Torres from the crow's nest. They're demanding surrender and return of stolen property. Eleanor stepped back from Marcus, straightening her shoulders in a gesture that suddenly revealed every inch of her noble breeding. I won't let him destroy you for my choices. This ends here. Like hell it does. Marcus moved to block her path to the rail. You think I'd hand you over to a man who sees you as property? You think I'm that much of a coward? I think you're brave enough to know when a fight can't be won. She reached up to cup his face in her hands. And I think you love me enough to trust that this isn't over. Before he could respond, she kissed him, fierce and desperate and full of everything she couldn't say. When she broke away, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I love you, Marcus Blackwood. Remember that. Whatever happens next. She pulled the emerald ring from her finger, the same ring her father had given her to seal her engagement to Harold, and pressed it into Marcus's palm. Hold this for me. I'll want it back when this is finished. The lead ship was close enough now for them to hear shouted orders, the creak of rigging as they prepared to board. Eleanor walked to the rail with her head held high, every step declaring her identity as clearly as any banner. Father, she called across the water, her voice carrying with aristocratic authority. I'll come aboard, but only if you guarantee safe passage for this ship and crew. They're under my protection. A laugh boomed across the waves, cold and familiar and utterly without warmth. You're hardly in a position to make demands, my dear daughter. But I'm feeling generous today. Marcus appeared at her side, his hand finding hers briefly. This isn't over, he said quietly, echoing her earlier words. Eleanor squeezed his fingers once, then released them as the longboat approached. No, she agreed, watching her father's men prepare to escort her back to a life she'd already escaped once. This is just the beginning. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the deck as the crimson dawn shuddered under the impact of another cannonball. Isabella pressed herself against the mainmast, her heart hammering as smoke and chaos swirled around her. Through the haze, she could see Nathaniel barking orders to his crew, his cutlass gleaming as he prepared to repel the boarding party from Lord Pembroke's ship. Take her alive, Pembroke's voice carried across the water, cold and commanding. The woman is mine by right. Isabella's blood turned to ice. Even here, on the vast expanse of the Caribbean, her past had found her. The lies she'd built her new life upon were crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. A grappling hook sailed through the air, followed by another, as the two ships drew closer together. Nathaniel's men rushed to cut the lines, but more kept coming. The inevitable was approaching with each passing second. Isabella! Nathaniel fought his way toward her through the melee, his dark eyes blazing with fierce protectiveness. Get below deck now! But she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She watched as Pembroke himself swung across the gap between ships, landing on the Crimson Dawn's deck with predatory grace. He was exactly as she remembered. Tall, imposing, with steel-grey hair and eyes like winter frost. The man who had destroyed her family and driven her to flee England now stood mere yards away. "My dear Margaret," Pembroke called out, his cultured voice cutting through the din of battle. "How marvellously dramatic this all is, though I must say this pirate costume suits you far better than widow's weeds." Nathaniel's head snapped toward Isabella, confusion flickering across his features. "Margaret?" The word hit her like a physical blow. In that moment, watching the dawning realization in Nathaniel's eyes, Isabella felt something inside her shatter completely. Not Margaret Ashworth, the broken woman who had fled England in disgrace. Not even Isabella, the mail-order bride seeking a fresh start. She was simply herself, raw, terrified, and desperately in love with a man who might never trust her again. Enough! The word tore from her throat as she stepped away from the mast, her chin lifting with newfound resolve. "Stop this, Pembroke. Your quarrel is with me, not these men." "Isabella, what is he talking about?" Nathaniel's voice was deadly quiet, his cutlass held steady despite the chaos around them. She met his gaze, her heart breaking at the wariness she saw there. "My name is Margaret Ashworth. I'm the widow of Lord Charles Ashworth, and I fled England because—" Her voice caught. "Because I discovered my husband had been selling information to the French. When he died, Pembroke tried to force me into marriage to cover up the scandal and claim Charles's remaining assets. The fighting around them had slowed, both crews sensing the tension of this confrontation. Pembroke chuckled softly. "Such a partial truth, my dear. Tell your pirate lover about the letters we found, the ones proving you were your husband's willing accomplice in treason." "That's a lie," Isabella said, but she could see doubt creeping into Nathaniel's expression. "Charles forged those letters to implicate me. I only discovered the truth after his death, when I found his real correspondence hidden in his study." "Convenient," Pembroke purred. "And where are these supposed real letters now?" Isabella's silence stretched too long. She had burned them, unable to bear the evidence of her husband's betrayal. It had been an act of grief and rage, but now it left her defenseless against Pembroke's accusations. Nathaniel stepped between them, his broad shoulders blocking Isabella from Pembroke's predatory gaze. "Whether she's Margaret or Isabella, she's under my protection now. Your English law means nothing on these waters." "Ah, but it will mean something when we return to Port Royal," Pembroke replied smoothly. "I have documents signed by the governor himself authorizing me to retrieve a fugitive traitor. Your protection, Captain, is meaningless against the Crown's authority." Isabella watched Nathaniel's jaw tighten. She knew he was calculating odds, weighing options, trying to find a way to fight the inevitable. But she also knew that continuing this battle would only put him and his crew in greater danger. "There is another option," she said quietly. Both men turned to look at her. The wind whipped her hair around her face as she stepped forward, her decision crystallizing with painful clarity. "I'll come with you willingly, Pembroke, but only if you let the Crimson Dawn sail away unharmed." "Isabella, no." Nathaniel reached for her, but she stepped back, tears threatening to spill over. "It's the only way," she whispered. "I won't be responsible for more bloodshed." Pembroke's smile widened triumphantly. How perfectly romantic, and utterly pointless. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as Evangeline stood at the bow, her fingers gripping the rail until her knuckles turned white. The island of Tortuga grew larger with each passing moment, its notorious reputation preceding it like a dark storm cloud. Behind her, she could hear Captain Blackwood barking orders to his crew, but his voice seemed distant, muffled by the thundering of her own heartbeat. 3 days had passed since she'd told him everything, about her true identity, about Lord Pemberton's threats, about the scandal that had driven her from England's shores. 3 days since he'd held her as she wept, promising that no harm would come to her while she remained under his protection. Yet now, as they approached the lawless haven that had sheltered pirates for generations, those promises felt as fragile as sea foam. "You're thinking too loudly again," came his voice behind her, warm and teasing despite the gravity of their situation. She turned to find him approaching, his dark coat billowing in the sea breeze. Even now, knowing what they faced, he moved with that characteristic confidence that had both frightened and captivated her when they first met. "How can you be so calm?" she asked, searching his weathered face for any sign of the worry that gnawed at her insides. "Pemberton's men could be waiting for us. This could all be a trap." He stepped beside her, his shoulder brushing hers as he gazed toward the approaching harbor. "Because running never solved anything, love. Trust me, I've tried." The endearment sent warmth through her chest as it always did, but it couldn't quite dispel the cold fear that had settled there. She watched as his jaw tightened, seeing the first crack in his composed facade. "Besides," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "I have something worth fighting for now." Before she could respond, Jenkins appeared at the captain's elbow, his weathered face grim. "Captain, there's a ship anchored in the harbor. Flying British colors, but she's not naval. Merchant vessel, but heavily armed." Evangeline's blood ran cold. "That's Pemberton's ship, the Britannia's Pride. I recognize her lines." Blackwood's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her trembling ones. "How many men does he typically travel with?" 20, perhaps 30, she whispered, hating how her voice shook. "But Captain..." You don't understand. Pemberton isn't just wealthy, he's cunning. He's survived the treacherous waters of London society for decades. He won't face you in honest combat." A slow smile spread across Blackwood's face, and for a moment she glimpsed the ruthless pirate that had terrorized merchant ships across the Caribbean. "Then it's fortunate that I've never been particularly honest myself." As they sailed into Tortuga's harbor, Evangeline could see figures moving on the deck of Pemberton's ship. Her stomach lurched when she spotted a familiar silhouette at the bow, tall, imposing, dressed in the finest clothes that money could buy. Even at this distance, she could feel the weight of his gaze upon her. "He sees us," she breathed. "Good." Blackwood's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "Let him see what he's truly up against." The crew of the Crimson Dawn worked with practiced efficiency, dropping anchor and preparing the longboat. But as they drew closer to shore, Evangeline noticed something that made her heart skip. Small boats filled with armed men were already pushing off from Pemberton's ship, moving to intercept them before they could reach the docks. Captain Torres called from the rigging. "We've got company!" Blackwood squeezed Evangeline's hand before releasing it. "Stay close to me," he ordered, then turned to address his crew. "Gentlemen, it appears we have some uninvited guests who wish to discuss business before we reach shore. Shall we show them proper pirate hospitality?" The crew's answering roar sent shivers down Evangeline's spine, but it also kindled something fierce within her chest. These men, this ship, this dangerous life, it had become home in ways her sheltered existence in England never had. As the enemy boats drew closer, she could make out individual faces among Pemberton's hired thugs. Her breath caught when she recognized the scarred features of Morrison, the man who had cornered her in London, whose leering promises had finally driven her to flee. "I won't hide below deck," she declared suddenly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I won't cower while others fight my battles." Blackwood turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. For a moment she thought he might argue, might try to protect her from the violence to come. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Then we face this together," he said simply. The first musket shot rang out across the water, splintering the rail mere inches from where they stood, but Evangeline didn't flinch. Instead, she stood straighter, her chin raised in defiance. Whatever came next, she would meet it not as a fleeing victim, but as the woman she'd discovered herself to be in this pirate's arms. The storm that had raged for 3 days finally began to subside, leaving the Serpent's Wake battered but triumphant against the grey dawn. Eleanor pressed her face to the porthole of Marcus's cabin, watching debris from what remained of Lord Pemberton's ship drift past like broken dreams on the churning waters. Behind her, Marcus moved with careful precision, binding his wounded shoulder where Pemberton's blade had found its mark during their final confrontation. The man who had pursued her across an ocean now lay beneath the waves, his threats silenced forever, but Eleanor felt no triumph, only a hollow exhaustion that seemed to reach her very bones. "It's finished," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough from shouting orders through the tempest. "You're free of him." Eleanor turned from the window, studying the man who had become everything she never dared hope for. Blood had seeped through the fresh bandage, and his dark hair hung loose around his shoulders, making him look more pirate than gentleman. Yet his eyes held that same tender regard that had undone her defenses from their very first meeting. "Am I?" she whispered. "The scandal in London, my father's debts, the shame I brought upon my family, those don't disappear simply because Pemberton is gone." Marcus crossed the small space between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "You are not the sum of others' judgments, Eleanor. You never were." The ship rolled with the settling seas, and Eleanor felt the familiar tug of uncertainty in her chest. Through their short, tumultuous marriage, she had discovered a love deeper than any ballroom romance, but love alone could not erase the practical realities that lay ahead. "What kind of life can we have?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're still a pirate, Marcus. Ships still fly from your colors, and the Royal Navy still wants your head. I'm still a woman fleeing scandal. We're both living outside the boundaries of respectable society. Perhaps, he said, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had fallen. But we're living, Eleanor, truly living, not merely existing within the confines others have built for us. A knock at the door interrupted them, and William's gruff voice called out, "Captain, you'll want to see this." Marcus reluctantly released her and opened the door. His first mate stood there holding a leather portfolio, water-damaged but intact. "Found this floating in the debris," William reported. "Thought it might be important." Eleanor recognized it immediately. Pemberton's private documents, the ones he'd used to track her across the Atlantic. With trembling fingers, she opened the portfolio and found not just her own correspondence, but letters from other women he'd similarly pursued, evidence of debts purchased and leveraged for unspeakable purposes. "He kept records of everything," she breathed, scanning through papers that revealed the full scope of his predatory dealings. "Marcus, this isn't just about me. There are others, women he was blackmailing, families he was destroying." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his expression growing darker with each page. "The authorities need to see this. But bringing this forward would mean returning to London, facing the very society I fled." Eleanor's hands shook as she held the evidence of Pemberton's crimes. "It would mean revealing our marriage, your identity." "There's a British naval station in Port Royal," Marcus said carefully. "We could arrange for these documents to be delivered through intermediaries, keep you out of it entirely." Eleanor looked up at him, seeing the man who had consistently chosen her well-being over his own interests. But she also thought of the women whose names appeared in Pemberton's files, women who might still be suffering under threats and coercion. "No," she said finally, her voice growing stronger. "I won't hide any more. These women deserve justice, and they deserve to know they're free of him. I'll return to London myself." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Eleanor, the risk—" "I know the risk," she interrupted. "But I also know what it's like to live in fear, to believe you have no choices. If I can spare others that suffering, I must." She closed the portfolio and met his gaze directly. "The question is whether you'll come with me. I know what I'm asking. You'd be walking into the heart of British naval power. But Marcus, I can't imagine facing this without you." For a long moment he was quiet, and Eleanor could see him weighing love against survival, partnership against prudence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same decisive tone she'd heard him use when commanding his crew through dangerous waters. "Then we sail for London," he said, "together." Outside, the sun finally broke through the storm clouds, casting golden light across the endless sea that had brought them together and would now carry them home. The morning sun painted the harbour in shades of gold and amber, as Isabella stood at the ship's rail, watching the bustling port of Nassau come alive. 3 months had passed since Lord Blackwood's defeat, 3 months of sailing free waters with Nathaniel at her side. The wanted posters bearing her name had been mysteriously removed from every port they'd visited, though she suspected the pirate brotherhood's influence extended further than she'd imagined. "Admiring our new home." Nathaniel's voice was warm against her ear as his arms encircled her waist from behind. She leaned back against his chest, marveling at how natural this felt now. "It's beautiful, different from what I expected." Nassau was indeed different from the lawless haven she'd imagined. Yes, there were pirates here, but also merchants, craftsmen and families. Children played in the streets while women hung laundry from balconies adorned with tropical flowers. It was a place where outcasts had built something resembling civilization. "The house overlooks the bay," Nathaniel murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You'll be able to see the Serpent's revenge whenever she's in port." Isabella turned in his arms, studying the face she'd grown to love so completely. The harsh lines that had once defined him had softened, though the strength remained. "And when she's not in port, then her captain will be exactly where he belongs, with his wife." The word still sent a thrill through her. Tomorrow they would speak their vows before the island's magistrate, making official what their hearts had already declared. But first, There was something she needed to do. "I want to write to my sister," she said quietly. "Elizabeth deserves to know I'm alive and safe." Nathaniel's expression grew thoughtful. "It could be dangerous. If your letter is intercepted—" "I know, but I can't let her spend the rest of her life wondering what became of me. I'll be careful. Reveal nothing that could lead anyone here." He nodded slowly, understanding as always. It was one of the things she cherished most about him, his ability to see not just what she needed, but why she needed it. "James can arrange for it to be delivered discreetly," he said. "The Brotherhood has contacts throughout England." They were interrupted by the sound of running feet on the deck behind them. Tommy appeared, his face flushed with excitement and what looked suspiciously like guilt. "Captain, there's a situation at the dock," he said breathlessly. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "What kind of situation?" "Well, sir, it seems some of the lads might have borrowed a few extra crates during our last resupply." Isabella bit back a smile as Nathaniel sighed deeply. Even in paradise, it seemed, pirates would be pirates. "Borrowed," Nathaniel repeated flatly. "Aye, sir, accidentally borrowed. The merchant is quite upset." "I imagine he is." "Very well, let's go make this right before the magistrate decides to postpone tomorrow's ceremony." As they prepared to disembark, Isabella caught sight of her reflection in the captain's cabin window. The pale, frightened woman who had fled England was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, bronzed by sun and sea, her eyes bright with purpose and love. The elaborate gowns and jewels of her past life had been replaced by practical clothing that moved with her body, that belonged to her new life. She was no longer Lady Isabella Fairfax, trapped by society's expectations and her family's shame. Nor was she Sarah Mills, the desperate mail-order bride who had written that first letter with trembling hands. She was simply Isabella now, about to become Isabella Cross, wife to a pirate captain and citizen of a place where the past mattered less than what you chose to make of your future. The streets of Nassau welcomed them with familiar chaos. Vendors called out their wares, sailors shared tales of distant shores, and somewhere a fiddle played a lively tune. Nathaniel handled the merchant's complaints with diplomatic skill, compensating him generously for the borrowed goods, while ensuring his crew faced appropriate consequences. Watching him work, Isabella felt a deep sense of pride. This was the man she had chosen, who had chosen her in return. Not the feared pirate captain of legend, though that man certainly existed when circumstances demanded it. Not the wounded soul she had first glimpsed behind his defenses, though she treasured those vulnerable moments between them. This was Nathaniel in his entirety, leader, protector, partner. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they made their way to the house that would be their sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring their wedding, and the days after would bring whatever adventures the future held. But tonight, Isabella stood on the threshold of her new life, her hand clasped firmly in Nathaniel's, ready to step forward into whatever came next. The woman who had once believed herself ruined beyond redemption had discovered something far more valuable than the reputation she'd lost. She had found herself, and in doing so had found love beyond anything she had ever dared to dream possible.